led by Sarah and Mike. But I'm Melissa Kaur from the Director for Grants and Contracts at Harvard Medical School. And I also have the pleasure of co-chairing the FDP Contracts Subcommittee along with Elizabeth Peloso from the University of Pennsylvania. Next slide, please. So just a brief high-level agenda for today's session is that we'll have the update from our OTA working group from Sarah White and Mike Kusiak, as well as some preliminary results from the survey on OTA that was run about a year or so ago. We'll also talk a little bit about the FDP and Cougar collaboration to collect some data by request from the DoD. And then Troublesome Clauses 2.0 will provide an update on some of the progress we've made there and our next steps. And as time allows, discuss what we've got, what else folks have got going on, any other suggestions. You know, we all love contracts. So just to reiterate what Lillian said, you know, we love audience participation at the FDP. You know, we are better when you all speak up and we can talk through your comments and, you know, benefit from your experiences and, you know, take suggestions for demonstrations. So throughout the session, please, you know, enter into the chat or raise your hand if you've got something you'd like to contribute. We'd love to hear from you, and I'll pass it off to Sarah and Mike to talk about OTAs.
So welcome everybody. I'm Sarah White. I'm the Associate Vice Chancellor for Research at the University of Tennessee Health Science Center. And Michael, do you want to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. I'm Mike Kusiak. I'm from the University of California. From our system-wide office is the Office of the President.
Next slide. So just a little bit of the background of what Other Transaction Authority is. So Other Transaction Authority permits federal agencies to enter into other transactions other than grants, cooperative agreements, or contracts. There are three uses of Other Transaction Authority: for research, basic or applied; prototypes is the second type; and production. Among the federal government, for the agencies that have applied for and gotten OT, it's viewed as a flexible mechanism that allows for rapid awards in clinical areas. So while OTs are generally not subject to federal laws and regulations, such as the Federal Acquisition Regulation or the Uniform Guidance, these agreements may borrow from other sources. And that's why they're problematic for us. Next slide.
And what we're seeing is we're seeing more of them coming into higher education. And that was sort of the call to action for our working group, is that we noticed a steady increase of them coming from the National Institutes of Health. And Sarah has this amazingly deep knowledge about other transactions that are coming to us from the Department of Defense.
Thank you. So this slide is just a little bit about the history of some of the legislation. And I would say, if you are deeply interested in this topic, to go look at some of this history about what is actually in the legislation for other transaction authorities and how they're actually structured, what they're actually supposed to do, because they're not completely relieved of the requirements that you have for any contract, right? So, but it's just how an audit would be determined, how IP is going to be determined. There's flexibility around those things, but those kinds of typical clauses still need to be in Other Transaction Authority awards.
But where they come from, I think, is instructive, right, Sarah? Because they did come from that defense space. It came first from NASA, and we're talking about like building missiles. You know, a project manager saying, I need to get that rocket booster built. And so the vision was, we're going to do it really quickly. We're not going to be encumbered by, you know, complex competition rules or having to deal with FAR, right? And it's only recently that we're seeing it come into the basic science space when it came into NIH in 2016.
Right, and now it's been 5 years that the NIH has had it, and we're again seeing, next slide, I think, we're seeing increased use of it. So OTs can take different paths, and as Mike said, they're challenging our traditional academic research, right? So the Department of Defense really does, in a way, lead OTs. And the OTs are, OTA awards are often through consortia for the DoD. And so what is consortia? Consortia are when the federal government, the DoD, awards a contract to an entity that then establishes the rules by which individuals, companies, and organizations can get access to OT funds. So the problem with consortia or that mechanism is that you need to belong. So universities and research institutions need to know these consortia exist, and then they need to apply for membership. And there's a fee for membership. It's usually not too exorbitantly high, but it's still a fee. And then there are also all sorts of terms and conditions that institutions agree to when they become members.
Well, the very idea, Sarah, right, that you're paying a fee to pay to play. I don't know if that's the right terminology here. I'm not trying to suggest any illegal activity, but it really is a challenge to what we think typically in academia. I can say at the UC system, as we've seen these memberships pop up, the question is like, how do we leverage them across our different campuses? And there's a certain ambiguity about them, I would say. Last month, we were just reading through a Department of Defense audit that came out about consortia, which really alludes to some of the challenges that we see with them when they, in terms of their accountability measures, questions about the membership fees, the management fees, sorry, that they charge. A lot of these consortia really can't even tell you how many other transactions they've entered into. So I think our spidey sense here, Sarah, is correct. Like in some ways, it's kind of the Wild West, even though we know that this has been around since like what, 56, but they're in 58, right? So, but they're in use. They're being used increasingly, and sort of the rules of the games are really unknown because inherently, the core thing about an OT is like there are no rules.
Right, and so I think one of the things as we go through this presentation, next slide, that we're going to be doing is we're going to be outlining some thought questions for people listening to this conversation and following it. So watch for those. Because after this presentation, maybe a week or so after, you will get an email if you attended this session, and we're going to ask you for your thoughts on these various aspects of OT so that we can sort of take the next step. So this is hot linked here to the NIH Office of Acquisition Management Policy Standard Operating Procedures for other transactions, which, you know, if you ever need some help getting to sleep, would be a really excellent thing to read. No, kidding aside, it's really well written, and it's not a long document, and it will help you understand the perspective of how the NIH is thinking about and what their internal guidance is for when they choose to award other transactions and when they don't. And one of the interesting points of that is that they have to meet tests internally before they determine whether an OT has to be used or there's some other mechanism that could be used. So can a traditional government contract or other cooperative agreement be used? What are the expected benefits of participation by prospective firms? And I think that's an interesting choice of words. Or consortium. Is there a better technology or research methodology available that would be better, more readily available, less expensive? Why would the prospective, again, vendor is an interesting choice of word, not participate if an instrument other than the OT was used? So next slide.
One of the big headlines, though, is the contrast, right, with NIH to DoD and now, well, DoD mainly. DoD, think about, these are coming to you almost indirectly as, I don't know if it's fair to call it pass through as from a pass through entity. That might be the wrong terminology, but it's the terminology I know. Whereas with the NIH, you're seeing these awards come directly from NIH. And Sarah has some really interesting observations about how they're coming from the Office of the Director. Sorry.
Yes, next slide. So since 2006, so the other transaction authority was granted to the Office of the Director at the NIH for his use to determine what were the top funding priorities and kinds of things that the NIH most wanted to do. So the Directors Program are some of the most prestigious and important awards that the NIH gives out. And so since 2016, there have been 515 OT awards for something like 2.5 billion about has been awarded in that time. And the Office of the Director has to approve any of the awards that would go out through another directorate. And 71% or almost 72% of the awards for OT from the NIH have gone out from the Director's Office. Below is the breakdown of the dollars and the NIH institutes that have awarded OTA.
Sarah, what do you think some of the concerns are that you're seeing all the activity or lots of the activity from the Office of the Director?
I think that, one of the concerns is the kind of programs and one of the most interesting or important areas of science right now is data. How are we going to use data? How are we going to use big data? And a lot of those programs are under the All of Us program, Precision Science. Those programs are coming out of the Director's Office and being funded with OT. So that's one interesting area. But aside from that, the OTA authority gives the director the ability to move those funds into OT, the OT mechanism, and OT mechanisms do not require peer review.
Yeah,
so,
and that I think right there is a big headline, right? When you think about academic institutions and how we normally engage. Although I think I shared this point with you, Sarah. I was in a conversation with several senior UC administrators from across the system, and this person noted that, why is everyone so freaked out about how DARPA does things, right? Their program managers just choosing winners, and that's based on their expertise and their background. So I think maybe the reckoning that we're probably going to have is more of that model of kind of that someone with expertise rather than classic peer review driving things. Although I think when we did the analysis, I didn't see any situation with the stuff coming from the Director's Office where it wasn't linked to a peer review.
Correct.
It does give more authority to
right. The ability is there to at least my knowledge, it has not been used yet.
Yeah.
Next slide.
Sarah and Mike, I'm curious what you guys think in terms of this growing volume of OTAs for projects like All of Us, or I think a lot of the long COVID RFPs were put out as OTA RFPs, in that it, perhaps pre-OT authority granted to NIH, we might have seen some of these activities as cooperative agreements, potentially, but it feels like consistent with the OT authority, there's been this growth in programs that aren't truly targeted towards basic science. All of Us, precision medicine,
COVID response,
the NHLBI data stage, really targeted towards research infrastructure, less from, an investigator having a great idea and reaching out to the NIH seeking funding to pursue that idea. So do you think that this is an indication that there's maybe a changing dynamic, or a changed focus of the OD on non-traditional research projects?
I do think that there is, like anything else, there's sort of a pendulum swing, right? And the pendulum is swung pretty far away from basic science and pretty much towards, very much towards applied science. And you see this in the NIH also with, how many clinical trials funding mechanisms we're now seeing. So I do have a concern for basic science with the OT, even though the OT legislation does allow for basic science projects. It's really more, the idea is to get a solution out there. And I'm also glad that you mentioned what happened with COVID. So the survey that we're going to get to shortly was sent out between January and February of 2020. Then of course, we all went through a lot of adjustments, but OT was used extensively during COVID,
Yep.
and very effectively, I would say, from my experience, at least with getting clinical trials in the industry, and with really, it was very effectively used. So it's interesting. I think that through COVID, OT made sort of more of a leap into continued usage. So we really need to be alert to what the consequences of it are.
Sarah, I can share the link. I'll look for it while we move to some other slides, but the link to the NIH reporter that pulls all of the OTA projects. And what's really cool about NIH reporter, and shout out to our friends from the National Institutes of Health, is that it does show you these thematic areas of where a lot of the work is being done. And you really see NIH with OTs, they're going after big ideas, right? And what we haven't seen for this fiscal year is these awards often get funded around September. So we haven't really seen this year's a lot of the activity that you normally see, but we're definitely seeing an upward trend from NIH. I'll find that link and share it.
Thank you. So
Sarah and Mike, we do have one other question in the chat real quick. Did you find that any agencies have limitations on the dollar amount or percentage of their funding that they can use to fund OTAs?
Yes, agencies do have dollar amount limitations, other than, I would say NASA, which is funded with other transaction authorities. So that's what the Space Act is other transaction authority. But others apply in their budget, like the budget they submit to Congress. They will note how much of their portion of their funds that they want to allocate towards other transaction. And what happens through that negotiation happens. But in general, to have other transaction authority, the floor starts at 500 million, and the ceiling is billions. So the NIH did request billions in their most recent budget that was submitted to Congress.
But when you see, that's the key point, Sarah, that we're seeing this legislatively defined about, you will have this bucket of money for OTs.
Yes,
yeah.
You will. And I think it kind of behooves us to watch what the proportion shift is, since this language here, this quote at the top, allows flexibility necessary to adopt and incorporate better business practices that reflect commercial industry standards and the best practices to award instruments. That's coming from the NIH. So it's interesting. So someone wrote an interesting, to clarify, do you have to be part of a consortium to apply for an OS for a solicitation? Yes, for several of the DoD consortiums. No, for the NIH. The NIH posts their OT announcements, which are often made in parallel with like an R mechanism or a U mechanism. There'd be an OT mechanism as well, so you'd have a choice. So agencies use very different ways to allow access to OT funding. Next slide. So go ahead, Mike.
Can we just sort of, I don't think we totally talked about flexibility, and I would just sort of caution the audience that you see a lot of language out there about this mechanism is flexible, this mechanism is flexible. So the question really becomes, flexible for whom? And it's flexible for the agencies. And when you think about resource allocation in your sponsor projects offices and where your expertise are, it's very challenging to get non-standard agreements from federal partners, right? You generally have expertise in your offices around FAR. You generally feel confident in how you accept grants. So that flexibility might work great. Maybe when you're staging things on the DoD side, I think that's great. But I think when you look at, particularly we see it more with NIH, I think there should be some caution. I know, for example, you might see OTs come through as a regular notice of grant award. That's the wrong term, but they'll come through like the same email address. And so if you start drawing down on them, you've accepted the terms and conditions. So something to be thoughtful about with regards to who the flexibility is for and how you're seeing these. Sorry, your thought question, Sarah.
Yes, so this is what we're going to follow up with to an email to the people who are attending this or who signed up to attend this. Would it be helpful to have federal agencies codify and publish their use requirements so that recipient organizations would have a better sense of what a traditional grant, cooperative agreement, or contract, when traditional grant, cooperative agreement, or contract would not be appropriate? So I think what we want to know is, are people in the research community curious about how these decisions are made about when to use OT? Next slide. So
Sarah and Mike, just a really quick clarification on the thought question. So one of the things that we've been talking about in the contract subcommittee and in the OTA working group is, you know, Sarah and Mike spearheaded this great data collection and research project, and we've collected a lot of information. And then, you know, what could FDP do to be useful in this space? And so one of the things that we wanted to do after the session where Sarah and Mike present all of this wonderful information is solicit some additional feedback, likely through a thought exchange that participants might have received for other sessions that are going on this week. But we wanted to present the information and then ask people to share their thoughts on potential demonstrations that might come out of this wonderful work. So peppered through the presentation, Sarah's included some thought questions to sort of get people thinking in terms of the questions that we might ask in follow-up to, but you'll receive an email, likely a link to one of those thought exchanges after the session to share additional thoughts.
Thank you for providing a much better explanation than I did. So we're going to go into a little bit of the survey results. So what we did with the survey is we wanted just one person per member institution to respond. We had 132 responses, and the survey was set up with branching logic. So the first question was, does your institution have OTA awards or not? And so we got 132 responses out of 181, which was terrific. At that time, though, 68 respondents had received OTA and 64 had not. So what that meant was then you received an email after, if you said, no, we have not, thank you for taking the survey. And then if you had an OT award, it opened and the additional questions were given to people. So we actually had 65 people that fully completed the survey that at that time, again, back in the early winter of 2020, had experience with OT. Next slide. So we asked, the first question we asked was, what agencies had you received of those able to give OT, which the list is here, which had you received an OT award from? And so NIH, DARPA, and DoD were the most prominent. And the others, we had very few awards that people were identifying. Next slide. So we were curious about whether the negotiation process took more time, less time, or about the same. Oh, and this was actually the response we got 54% of the time. The most common response was that individual OTA funded agreements vary widely enough that some take more time and others take less time to negotiate. So kind of what we would have expected. Next slide. Mike, do you want to talk about this one?
Yeah, I think this goes to the heart of what stresses out folks at sponsor projects offices when you're negotiating an award is publication and IP rights. I think particularly on the DoD side, you see this, this is entrenched with, for-profit entities that you're working with. Our survey captured that, complicated sub-board flow down, confusing and inconsistent terminology, payroll evidence issues, unilateral modifications, processes in the contract can be changed by the government without our approval, entitled to property. But a common theme and some of the things that like make us lose sleep at night is around, intellectual property. We know that BIDOL is sort of like the standard that defines how we understand IP in universities, and we are open environments at universities, right? So when you start seeing provisions that might stop us from publishing our research results or embargo that causes alarm.
From a practical point of view, the people are asking basic questions about how processes work with OT. And one thing I wanted to say about the survey that was most valuable and why we wanted to go to a thought question format is that the comments people gave were really the most useful information of the survey. And so these when it's in quotations, it means that one of our constituency had that comment to make. Next slide. There again, here are some comments that people made about OT and their understanding of it. Subrecipient funding pops up, how we manage that pops up as a question, and whether the terms are in fact much more favorable to industry than they are to universities. Are we as a constituency really being given the latitude we need for our standard operating procedures that we're used and the ways we're used to be operating?
Sarah, I know, like, I get kind of anxious when I'm at staff meetings and we start talking about intellectual property, anything. That's just not my jam. But really, the first comment here, I really gave me pause about this, how we are so entrenched in how BIDOL works. Maybe that's a missed opportunity in how we are working with private entities, particularly when, some of my colleagues of UC have talked about how, to this comment, they've received more favorable IP terms. And so what does that mean? So I think, something to extract from this is like, how agile are we as negotiators, and can we see a bigger picture? And what do our university policies let us see that bigger picture?
And I think, an important thing about the actual process of negotiating when with an entity, when you get an OT, is they often are flexible with giving universities, at least in my experience, what we want. But we need to know what we want. We need to be asking. Next slide. So here were some other negotiation pain points. So leveraging of standard FAR clauses in inappropriate circumstances. Sometimes OTs will include FAR clauses, and sometimes they're FAR clauses we don't like. Flexibility.
And they're FAR clauses, but they're not FAR clauses, right? I think that's what I point out, right? It's merely the language. It's not saying that the FAR applies. The audit from DoD kind of talks to that.
Yeah. It's very much a menued approach that's used by the agencies. I'll pick this particular clause because I think it fits with what I'm trying to do, or this particular reference because it's what I'm trying to do. And one of the things in the OT legislation we should sort of keep ourselves mindful of is that OT, again, is designed to be flexible, but it's also designed to allow participation of a constituency from whom you want the solution. So in that, it means that we need to stand up for what universities and research institutions need, and ask for appropriate terms to be given to us, because the flexibility exists in the mechanism itself for that to happen.
Jacelyn, I really appreciate your comment. We've heard that before. Our office has sponsored projects. Might have spent more time negotiating one of our OTAs, but the agency gave us literally 1 business day from receipt of the agreement to accept or forego funding. That's kind of a scary thing when you think like the risk analysis of a pretty large contract that these, or agreement, I should say, that these represents. Oh, here's another one. Another item to watch for at proposal stage is that some require cost share. Nonprofits are generally able to request a waiver or reduce cost share. Also, some agencies prefer a fixed price milestone project. Particularly with OTs, like I'm kind of like I'm known for the persons who sort of hold the line within the UC system when it comes to indirect costs recovery and cost sharing in that regards. It seems like the nature of OTs, I don't like the idea of cost sharing in many of these projects, considering what the incentives are for the partners. But that's just my editorial comment.
No, and that is something that people did identify. We can move to the next slide as something that they wanted. So the OTs and audit. One of the things again in the legislation is OTs are required to have some sort of an auditing capability. And in the FAA has had an audit, NASA had an audit, and now the DoD has had an audit of their use of OTs. And in all cases, their inconsistency and sort of their inconsistency of application of the mechanism and an understanding of why they're using it when, and how they are accounting for the use of the OT funds has been somewhat problematic.
I mean, we've gone back and forth with this internally at UC, right? With my colleague in costing policy about what is this money? How do we classify it? I mean, we just actually changed our systems, and whoops to my colleagues at UC, we need to communicate it to you, but we'll actually start tracking OTs as OTs because they are distinct from contracts and grants. But Sarah, I think something what we've determined even maybe on the federal side is that federal systems aren't really set up to even track OTs, and that's part of the DoD audit speaks to that issue.
Yep. And that same criticism has been in any agency audit that's happened. So, but for us, for universities, we asked if people were applying the principles of 2 CFR 200, and 57% of those polled who answered that question responded yes, that they were using 2 CFR 200. And also, next slide. Okay. One of the other questions that we had asked was has your university adapted its, or your institution adapted its systems in order to accommodate OT and track OT mechanisms? And at the time, not many had, and I believe that has actually really changed. I know for ourselves at the University of Tennessee, we've updated our systems so that we track them, and I think most institutions now are probably tracking OT. So we asked a question: Is your institution a member of a consortia? These would be DoD consortia. 57% of the respondents answered yes. Has your institution been requested to cost share an OT? Most answered no, or not sure. Next question. Next slide.
Can I just make a point? Cynthia Hope, thank you. Shout out to Cynthia about your comment about an OT fund in the consortium. I'm negotiating with, now has several different interrelated agreements that have an unfortunate order of precedence. In addition, its bylaws are only online and can be changed at the whim of its board. Of course, its admins and RPIs point to the dozen of other research universities and institutions that have joined. Cynthia, you should be a part of a system of universities, because that's always fun when they play one campus off another. But if we join and then only have one day to negotiate an award received through the consortium, SI. So we are with you, Cynthia. Solidarity with you.
I would agree with those comments. I know for my university joining consortium that it took for us to join one of the consortiums over a year, because we were fighting that uphill, kind of salmon battle to get changes in to the consortium agreement and we had to follow the chain all the way back to up to get those changes in that latitude that we needed made. But I think that, you know, it would be really good to have universities chat about how the consortium agreements work and sort of band together a little bit more. So one of our thought questions is, as non-commercial entities, should universities and other nonprofit research entities be exempted from the need to cost share on OT awards? So the thought behind why there's cost sharing on OT and the requirement for OT is that OT are considered to be dual use, and not dual use in the sense of export control regulations. Dual use in the sense that the solution that's being created for the government is also something that could be a public use. So the government wants the solution to be designed for their use, but also so that it can be commercialized. That's the dual use. And so OT are frequently designed for practical solutions that end in a prototype that go into production. And so because the thought is there that the solution will eventually be profit making, that's why the cost sharing comes into play. But universities are almost always defined as the non-traditional partner. And because we're almost always defined as a non-traditional partner, and we'll get to that a little bit later, we are often exempted from having to cost share. That cost sharing requirement falls back onto the industry partner. But this is probably an area where we could do a better job as a constituency, sort of understanding our position on the required cost sharing, because we're not commercial entities.
So Sarah, the comments are consistent. They're cracking me up. It's this situation of, I've got a day to accept this. Stephen Dowdy, who I would say is probably the dean of research data out there in ERA, talked about putting an OT flag. Two questions, and I think this is a good question, Steve. Where would you put them for NSF heard? What procurement rules are followed, assistance or contract rules? Well, to your second question, it's like the third, it's like behind door number 3. Like, this is door number 3 right here. It's its own separate thing. And I think the challenge is that the volume of these is so small that they haven't appeared, right? We're starting to see them in the past half decade or so really appear more often. And where would you put them on your NSF heard? You know, I think that's a great question. I'm going to note that and talk to the person who coordinates that for UC, and maybe we should actually reach out to NSF heard staff about how they think about that. But I don't believe, for example, like on USA Spending and FAFATA, it's even recognized. We've talked about for our financials, our annual financial report, how to put that in our CFA. Is that what it's called?
Yes.
It doesn't seem to be an appropriate place to put it there. So it seems like the transaction's growing within federal agencies, but federal systems haven't necessarily been updated to reflect that. That's good. Thank you, Jamie. Maybe Jamie, offline, we can talk to you about that, because there has been confusion in our research and conversations about that.
Yep.
So just a couple comments on the timing, because I think there seems to be a lot of chatter in the chat on the timing. And I wonder, you know, so our own experiences at my institution are consistent, and it's also consistent with use of something like OTA for COVID, right? Is that you might choose this mechanism when the timeline does not allow for more traditional methods, right? So the urgency may come from the fact that it is a more urgent project. We've even had a sponsor ask us to confirm acceptance of the template terms at proposal stage, right? So try not even to leave the one day at the award stage, but like be able to go right to go time. And I don't know, what do you guys, would you guys have similar experiences that the urgency of the work is consistent with the timeline? Or are these sort of
we haven't
false deadlines?
We've had that with the clinical trial pieces. One thing I would, suggest to people is generally we've known when something's going to be funded by OT. And what our strategy has been here is to sort of reach out ahead of time, start the dialogue early, be in conversation with the program officers, et cetera, so that, that's not always possible, but sometimes it is. And we had that happen recently with one where they said, look, when this comes, you're going to have like 24-hour turnaround, but let's chat now about we're putting it together. So sometimes it's possible to help it along when you know you're going to get it. Other times, like what happened with BARDA with some of the really big clinical trials that were funded, you're just one of a number that's going to be funded. So it's sort of, I think, strategies, developing some strategies for understanding what's going to be flowed down to you would be a useful thing to try and maybe get ahead of, if it's at all possible, or think about how we can, again, work with agencies to maybe get this to be a little bit more organized. Next slide.
Acknowledging two questions. One question and one comment. When the work veers from fundamental research and you need to terminate, how difficult is the negotiation?
We lost you.
You lost my voice?
Yes, now it's back.
Let me try that again. When the work veers from fundamental research and you need to terminate, how difficult is the negotiation on this without the FAR termination clause? And I'm not a contract or a agreement negotiator. Do you have any anecdotal experience on this, Sarah? Or
in the consortia, there are several components to your consortia agreements. There are ways that you can have the ability to terminate. I haven't had to terminate one personally, but that is something that you want to make sure that gets negotiated so that if you need to terminate, you can. I don't think it would be particularly challenging, but termination is never the most fun thing any of us get to do.
And I want to congratulate Lori Schultz, who says, we got lucky. Our first OTA was NIH, and they gave us several meetings to consume all the info before sending the award and negotiating. So you got lucky indeed.
And that does happen. So
on the termination question, I think the key takeaway from a lot of our experiences, and I think this discussion is, if you want it, you got to negotiate it. You got to make sure it's in the agreement, right? And one of the challenges with some of the OTAs that we've entered into is that it's often one-sided. The government wants to be able to terminate the OTA if it's no longer a priority project or the goals that they're interested in aren't being met, but they don't want you to be able to terminate as the recipient because they need you. And so if you have situations that your institution would feel that you need to terminate for, that might be something that you need to fight for in negotiating the OTA in the one day that you have to negotiate.
There were questions in the survey about, we asked a question, what have you always wanted to know about OTAs, but were afraid to ask? We had many questions. One of them was, why do federal government agencies add FAR clauses to OTA when OTAs are not contracts? Good question. Another was, and we've had also in this dialogue that we've been seeing, our university is considered non-traditional contractors. And this is the definition from the DoD of when an entity is not considered to be a traditional defense contractor. Part of what's in these definitions typically is, have you had OTA from a particular agency for at least a one-year period preceding the solicitation of sources? So I think what's going to happen is, as universities get more and more OT, we may be pulled into being considered traditional defense contractor partners because of the regularity with which we're going to get the mechanism. So I think for myself, this is a question that I would like, really to be explored further. Another question a person had was, are there any risks in accepting OTAs? And of course, there are numerous, and we've been talking about some of them. One of the question was, what's the advantage to the agency in using OTA? And I think my next slide goes into that. And Mike?
Yeah, well, let me just sort of, I think that combines like the first question and the last question. And if you read the DoD audit that we shared, it kind of speaks to this. So they use the language because it's already written. It doesn't mean the FAR is applicable. It just means that they're using that language. But I think one of the concerns I would have would be particularly on the defense side, has like the FAR grown so complex that people just want to like do something else? I mean, is this sort of like, is this the emergency escape valve, if you will? Right? I mean, I just shout out to anyone out there who regularly negotiates FAR clauses, because I'm not that person. And it takes a very specific type of knowledge and expertise there. And I know, I mean, even within like, a system like UC, it's a very small end of people who really are engaged with FARs. So I think some of the things that you see hinted at is maybe we are looking for an easier way to do this from an agency point of view. And maybe that's the advantage of using OTA. NIH has some very prescriptive rules about like your decision tree about what you can do. The DoD audit that we shared kind of alludes that maybe some of those rules are kind of blurry.
And I think that statement's true, but I also think that in its genesis, the OTA mechanism was really supposedly designed to allow a level of competition for entities that had business solutions for the government, but didn't have the infrastructure to deal with federal acquisition regulation, or even 2 CFR 200, previously the circulars. So they're aiming at getting the best solution from the best provider and giving them the flexibility to provide that solution. So it's supposed to be something that's a win-win. I don't know whether it always is or not. I think that's one of the things we're really deliberating now, right?
It's kind of, I mean, so it's like an interesting thought thing for me, because in some ways they're speaking to like the administrative burden or sort of the prison of their own rules that have sort of, that keeps them away from getting to the thing that they want. And I think we fairly kind of critique some of the issues that we face, but is one person's flexibility, how does that challenge our own ways of doing business? I think that's sort of the fundamental issue here, Sarah. For us, institutions of higher education and independent research institutes.
Next slide. So our OTAs, the future of research funding. I think that's a really important question for the research community to start thinking about. Would you use a standard FDP subaward template to issue a subaward on an OT prime? Should OTAs be tracked in some special way for reporting purposes, since there's no CFDA number associated with them? So all of these things are conundrums that these are comments that came from the survey, and they're all things that I think any institution that has OT funding is grappling with. So I definitely think there's follow-up that might be useful for FDP to consider.
I love this question from Judith Ryan. How are institutions applying the cost principles? Can OTA provide costing relief? IDC rates above negotiated rates, inclusion of admin costs, TDC versus MTDC, charging for costs that are often in our IDC rates, like research and computing. I love that question because I think a growing consensus I've seen in the higher education community in particular, conversations we've been having within the UC system is when you're dealing with for-profit entities in particular, all bets are off in some ways. Look to I think Yale did this a few years ago. It was so inspiring when I saw it. And it tells you what a geek I am. And I can't believe I'm like this is what I do, but they use the uncapped rate for administration As a policy, they said if you're going to work with a business, it's going to be the uncapped rate, the rate that we propose in our F&A negotiations. And so that's a pretty high rate. I like the idea of consistency. I don't like sort of building, creating something just because. So using the language of our F&A rate agreement, I think is really appropriate. But I think there's some really innovative policy solutions out there, like I was saying with Yale, to uncap your rate. But to me, like some of these type of engagements feel more like how you would engage with a for-profit entity. But I could be wrong. I think it probably takes analysis for each one, and that's the bigger challenge, right? When you think about applying consistent costing principles.
And I think that we want to be careful about what kind of flexibility we ask for, because one of the questions we asked in the survey was, have you been asked to negotiate a different F&A rate with an OT? And the response was 57% had, in fact, of the constituents been asked to negotiate a different indirect cost rate for an OT award. And that's, how we sort of solve that and look at that. Should that be something that's different universities are making different decisions about? What does that do? Like Judith's question is a really, really good one. Does that just, truncate or really, how does that really affect your indirect cost rate and consistency in applying it? And it seems to me it's sort of dueling federal agencies, right? That you're negotiating a contract in essence, and you have an indirect cost rate with the DCCA or whoever you're negotiating with. And that's supposed to apply to your research portfolio and to your sponsored programs portfolio. And if another branch of the government is asking you to ignore that, well, I think that puts universities and research institutions in a really awkward position.
I mean,
it strikes me a little bit. Oh, sorry.
No, my colleagues from UC who are on this will probably laugh, but like I tend to think like if you can go for it, you go for it. When it comes to indirect cost recovery, we should never position ourselves as these institutions to say we're going to walk away from indirect costs if there's an opportunity there. So that's all. Melissa.
But it strikes me that a lot of the considerations that you guys are putting out there are interrelated, right? It makes sense perhaps to say, could we negotiate a different IDC rate? Could you cost share if we're also getting more IP ownership, right? IP ownership comes with a greater investment in the project because, as Sarah mentioned, maybe the company or the non-traditional contractor is hoping that they will be able to make a profit off of the public use of the deliverables. And so we sort of have to be careful, like you said, like what we wish for in terms of if we ask for one, there might be sudden expectation that we would have to be doing the other. And
I appreciate Stephen Dowdy's.
I think,
Stephen Dowdy just pointed out that they have a DoD contract with a 26% cap. And maybe an analogy for me to sort of think about this is if you've ever dealt with European Commission agreements that throw like Nestle in there with Harvard, like it's just, you have for-profit, there's no distinct type of entities you're working with. And I think particularly if you're dealing in a consortium with for-profit entities, that really puts into focus, like, why should a nonprofit subsidize its costs? But yes, it is interconnected with broader issues. So it's a fun thought problem.
It is, and we're getting tons of just amazing comments from people and interesting information. But I'm going to go to the next slide. And here's one of our thought questions. So agency processes, and this is coming from DoD guidance, literally, agency processes should be fair and transparent and should be conducted in accordance with industry norms for the technology being solicited. That's the rule book. And here's the thought question we want to ask people. Does your institution find the OTA solicitation process to be fair and transparent?
Probably like, it depends.
It depends, but I would say that's probably for myself. That's one of the chief concerns I actually have about the OTA mechanism, is it doesn't have to be disseminated in the same way that a federal contract or grant would be. Next comment. Next comment. Here's our final comment. There's no clear definition of what other transaction is, since it is defined by what it is not. Could more of a definition help us to better navigate this space?
And I think that's why, Sarah, we have the FTP, and that's where we get to navigate. And this could be an opportunity for us to kind of frame what we're doing to wrap things up here for the project. We are working on a white paper that we will have finalized by September. But some of it, we have some emerging, I think, some proposals, or Melissa's question is like, what's the demonstration? What's the demonstration, right? So I very optimistically see FDP as a place where we engage with our federal partners, and there could be an opportunity to work more closely with NIH. What are some guiding principles for OTs? And maybe there's some issues around costing, IP, et cetera, that we could build a consensus, kind of like how we did back in the day with research terms and conditions, but previously to that, like the FDP terms and conditions. Maybe we could have a set of principles that guide what you might see sort of in a basic OT coming from NIH. That could be one thing to talk about.
But I don't want to leave the other federal agencies out, because
of course,
it's really important, particularly with DoD and DARPA, and people did in the survey also have several positive comments to make about how the agencies worked on these that I don't want to ignore. So I think that next slide. So please feel free to contact Mike and me with any questions. And always Melissa and Missy can be contacted as well. But we're interested in what you have to say and what the next steps ought to be. There's a lot of interest in this particular topic, and we're happy to continue to work on potential improvements for the research community. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming today. We really appreciate having the opportunity.
We did get a.
I think we have one last question in the chat about considerations that post-award offices have to pay attention to, and it sounds like it depends. The classic "it depends" answer is what you guys would say, is that because these aren't necessarily automatically subject to the standard rules, you have to ask, what are they subject to? Would you agree with that, or other expansion on that?
I would totally agree with that, and I think that that's an area that we haven't paid enough attention to be perfectly honest.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know who initiates. I mean, you're probably award acceptances on your sponsor projects outside, and I know one of my colleagues and I, who's watching this today, we kind of discussed the situation at her campus where they didn't know it was an OTA. Like, it just kind of came through the email. So like, I mean, even in our sponsor projects offices, we have to be mindful. But on the post-award side, it's, I think, being very mindful of the specific terms and conditions. And wow, it's been such a long time since I've had to deal with a local instance of COEUS, and like how you make sure you have all those articulated in your award setup. But I would think that we probably just need to build some expertise on how you would articulate those deviations from standard practice. Because I know a lot of our processes in our post-award side, and I think it's a good question, Juan, are automated. Like, we make assumptions, like if we're dealing with an R01, this is how you're going to draw things down. This is how you're going to deal with it. So
I would say,
we'll note the question.
Go ahead.
We'll note the question. Sorry, Sarah.
No, I'm sorry. For my team, I would say on the post-award side, we've had not so many questions about the invoicing and receiving of funds. That really hasn't been a problem. But what we're really worried about are some of the questions that people asked previously. It's more the audit and the tracking, the FDA number, Those are the things, and are we our systems adequately covering them? So, yeah. So,
Oh, thanks.
now
All right, well,
Kind of you.
we may have time at the end for additional discussion or reach out to Sarah and Mike, but if we could go to the next slide, we'll move on to the troublesome clauses portion of the session for today. And troublesome clauses, do they still exist? I don't know, my contract negotiator people, what do you think? Next slide, please. So, those who have been with the FDP for a long time will recall what was just called troublesome clauses, but we're now moving into calling it Troublesome Clauses 1.0, the initial database. And it was developed as a resource to FDP membership, both institutions and the agency members, to help improve, the negotiation of contract and grant terms. And the goal was to provide information where you could go into the database and you could search for, hey, has anyone else ever encountered this clause? But also so that we could report out on various features, such as how long does it take us to resolve certain issues? What is the outcome? Do we walk away? Do we eventually get to something that works for both parties? And then, how often do certain issues come up by sponsor types? So do we see publication issues more often with DoD? Do we see IP issues more often with a certain sponsor? And just to note that the site is technically still live. So if you go to the FDP website or you search for FDP Troublesome Clauses, the website is still live, but it's built on an older infrastructure that requires updating both from a technical perspective. I think it was originally launched in something like 2007 or so. And so, database technology, web interface technology has just changed a lot since then. But also for making sure that we're able to track some of the most current issues. So for example, all of the things that we just talked about in terms of OTAs, it wasn't as much of an issue, back when Troublesome Clauses 1.0 was developed. And so maybe we need to be thinking about how we could track information about that particular mechanism, et cetera. Next slide, please. So we started off with asking a question, are there still issues here that exist? Because I think that, negotiation challenges went quiet for a little while. We used to have, really significant issues with publication restrictions and, DFAR clauses and, including those restrictions when it was for fundamental research and an educational institution and it wasn't really necessary. And there was a lot of great work, largely coming out of the first Troublesome Clauses database and a survey with, in collaboration with Cougar, that helped drive us to some change in that space. We got some great memos supporting, the way that we shouldn't see publication restrictions in contracts for fundamental research at educational institutions. And it does potentially seem like it's not the same. There might be different challenges, but maybe there are still challenges. Next slide, please. So here's where I'm going to sort of hand it off to Missy to talk a little bit, as a flashback to the past. We have another opportunity through Cougar to collect some data and interface with DoD, and I'll hand it off to Missy.
Great, thanks, Melissa. So I think on the last slide we talked, there was a little bit of a blurb about institutional policies and the impact of those on the ability to accept what was previously a troublesome clause. And I think a great example of that was around the DFAR's 7,000 clause for export controls. And we were able to get the carve out for fundamental research on the A3 and have been able to remain with the DoD in particular, very clear guidelines around what the troublesome clause meant. So perhaps we've fixed something around export controls for a little bit, but it doesn't mean that there's not new troublesome clauses out there. So DoD approached, and I talked to you guys a little bit about this in January, DoD approached Cougar initially around, hey, are there still issues around fundamental research contracting or not? Kind of what are the pain points and what's out there? So working with FDP and Cougar together sort of in parallel, we wanted to look and see kind of what's going on. So what we did initially was we did I'll call it a pilot pre-survey amongst just subcommittee members for the contracts committee to see kind of what are your pain points now? Are you still seeing troublesome clauses around that? May I have the next slide, please? And at the same time, in parallel, there was a Cougar survey that went on. And so here are kind of the differences between those two surveys. On the Cougar side, it was just a generalized, what's your experience been around contracting with DoD? Kind of are there pain points? It was one response per institution. And the focus was specifically on fundamental research. We went a little bit broader on the FDP survey, and it's a transactional focus, just like the old troublesome survey, the troublesome clauses 1.0 was, where you could go in and put by an individual transaction by transaction basis. Here was this clause, here was the problem, here's what we did to try to negotiate it, here is the outcome. We either accepted it, we negotiated it, or we walked away. So it was one response per contract rather than one response per institution. So kind of very, very different worlds that we're looking at. And also on the FDP survey, we didn't have a predefined focus on fundamental research. So it was so this was much more generally, what are your pain points in negotiating? And it was limited a little bit to DoD around DoD grant contracts in general. And we did get a few responses that were not even limited to DoD. So there are certainly some things out there to look at. May I have the next slide, please? So preliminary results, and this is just from the FDP survey. I'm sure no one on this call will be surprised that there are still some issues, especially after the OTA conversation with contracting on DoD awards. This is seen across the board from DoD primes to subcontracts and OTAs, all of them in there. The largest number of responses that we received were related, however, to subcontracts. And in with those subcontracts, interestingly, it wasn't, oh, small companies are particularly problematic or industry is inflexible. A good number of the problems were actually with other educational institutions or research institutions. So some of this we may be doing to ourselves by accepting what we can accept without thinking about more industry broadly. What's the impact going to be on our subcontractors when we do that? In particular, we had about 106 responses. Of those, 70 were related to subawards, 13 were with educational institutions, 22 with large industry, and that may have also included some of these consortia, and 28 with small businesses. There were 3 CRADAs mentioned, 5 OTAs, and 24 prime awards. I think the CRADA one is particularly interesting because that's a different sort of beast, and I don't think that's one that we've really thought about all that much before, because it's generally in the context of we're going to go do this cooperative thing with you or use your facilities to do that. So that may be something that we may, in Troublesome Clauses 2.0, want to delve into with a little bit more rigor than we did in the past. Interestingly, almost none of the issues were related to fundamental research. And in fact, only 13 transactions were related to issues specifically to fundamental research that were reported to this. So this leads to the question, is it just not a thing anymore? Or are institutions just not consistently asking for determinations when they believe one's applicable? As our policies have changed and more institutions can accept some restrictions at some points in time? Have we just gotten so fluid in our institutional practices about how we negotiate that we very quickly move on from the fundamental research piece to get the contract in place more quickly when we can? Go to the next slide, please. So clearly contracting issues still exist. They're not fixed over time because it's not about fundamental research anymore. It's about security, cybersecurity. It's about CUI, whether it's present or not. It's about CMMC requirements and understanding what applies to the particular award. So it's a little bit more all over the place. And I think that's really important to understand because it points to the fact that a Troublesome Clauses 2.0 database shouldn't necessarily be a fixed set of solutions, but should be questions, but should be something that's flexible over time so that we can use it not only to track progress on what we already know is difficult, but use it to more rapidly identify new issues as they emerge and work together to try to figure out how to solve them for us. So I think the next slide. And I'm going to pass it back to you, Melissa.
Thanks so much for sharing those survey results with us, Missy. Really looking forward to what comes out of the continuing conversations with Cougar and the DoD and some of this space, particularly as we look forward. I'm not sure that that's the right word, but as we look to the future of CMMC really maturing and becoming a factor in more and more awards. The FDP transactional Qualtrics survey that we ran with working group members was a kind of a kill two birds with one stone type of effort in that we both wanted to collect some of the transactional data that might be helpful in these continuing conversations with DoD on the troublesome clauses, but also test out how we might ask questions about some of these new clauses. Because in the original Troublesome Clauses database, when you think of the original 7,000 clause, it was problematic that it was included. So you just needed to get it out. And here we have issues where, you know, it's okay for the 7,000 clause to be included as long as we have a fundamental research determination. I can live with this CUI clause if I also know what it is that I'm receiving and it's clearly marked and all of the other things that go along with the CUI program requirements are done. So it's a little bit of a different challenge of how to collect information on some of the difficult negotiations that folks are experiencing, because it's more asking, did you get this clause and also get all of the other information that you should have gotten to go along with it in many cases? So we learned a lot of really good things, I think, through the survey in terms of how we want to be asking a question to get the information that we're looking for, but also what type of data integrity measures do we want to put in place when we launch the eventual Troublesome Clauses 2.0 database, so that we can be reviewing the responses that are entered to make sure that we've got good data. Because of course, the ultimate goal is, you know, the next time we have an opportunity to interface with a funding agency, we just go to the database and pull the data. We don't have to go through a special data collection effort. So we want to be kind of regularly making sure that that data is good, and also developing systems to make sure that we are continually evaluating the types of issues that we're collecting information on, or the types of clauses that we're targeting for the data collection. And so our sort of next goal after we completed that pilot data collection effort was to create a table of current priority issues. And we had a great, Brian Lowinger and Colin Rich led a little working group that pulled together this wonderful table that outlines what some of the issues are, why they're challenges, and potential considerations to think through as you pursue a solution. We're just putting some finishing touches on that, and our goal is to get that posted up on the FDP website soon. We'll send an email out to the contracts listserv when that's available. So here's a plug for the contracts listserv. If you haven't signed up already, there's a little link at the top of the main FDP website to sign up for listserv. And that is intended to be a living document of sorts. Our goal isn't to publish it once and consider it done, but to make sure that we're continually evaluating, to make sure that we're adding clauses as they surface as potential issues, and maybe removing clauses if we are able to get to some relief on those negotiations. And then our next step is to work on detailed system requirements. I've learned from some of my amazing colleagues, you know, in the expanded clearinghouse or the CUSP effort, if you guys are aware of those database type projects, that, you know, before you start building a database, you really have to know what you want it to look like. You have to be able to tell a developer what you need. And so we have some great resources from those efforts that we can borrow from, but we need to be creating our own detailed requirements. And so, you know, if there are a couple people out there that really just have a love for detailed system requirements and would like to work with me on that, don't worry, we do have some examples to start from, so we're not totally starting from scratch. I put my email address in here if you're interested in working on that. I also saw in the chat that there was some conversation about the link to the original Cougar AAU report. And I believe Alex popped the link in the chat because there's some issues with the link on the main FDP website. And so we'll make sure that that's updated. But that was one of the main work products out of the original Troublesome Clauses database was the report with Cougar AAU, as well as, you know, facilitating some of the conversations. Next slide, please. So we've got a few minutes left in the session. If there's anyone that would want to post a question or comment or, you know, another idea in the contract space for FDP to consider. All right. It has been about 80 minutes of contracts. Oh, Alex, you want to talk about CMMC? So much fun. I think there are definitely a few folks in our working group that have done some initial assessments and posted assessments. If anyone is interested in coming off of mute and sharing your experiences. But I think this is definitely, CMMC is definitely an emerging area that we're going to be discussing a lot more and make sure that we're tracking any potential issues in the Troublesome Clauses 2.0.
Yeah, so Alex has asked if anybody's done their basic assessment. I think you know, that's one question. The other question is, who's had follow-up on their basic assessment and kind of known whether or not it's acceptable to DoD for the kind of contracts that they're applying for. So Stacy or Ian, do you want to go off mute and talk about your experience a little bit? Lillian, can we unmute Stacy?
Yeah, I got it. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, I apologize in advance if my dog starts to bark. There are people outside. So I'm with Penn State University, and at Penn State, we have the requirements of the rule, the DoD rule, state that you have to have your assessment done prior to an award. They revamped everything, and then they were initially going to do it at the proposal stage, that you had to have your base assessment. And the base assessment doesn't mean that you have to be 100% compliant. The base assessment says that you identify where you are in the scope. So what we're doing is we're working with our Office of Information Security. And when a proposal comes in or a request for certification that we're compliant and we've done our base assessment, or that we're able to do it, we run it past them, verify, so that they can go and see what the environment is going to require in the event that the 7012 clause applies, because the 7000, the DFARS, and everything is related to DoD. So that's something else that we're funding, and I'll talk about that in a sec. But what we're doing is identifying where we are in the assessment to meet NIST 800-171, along with the additional CMMC requirements, and then identifying a date where we anticipate we're going to be 100% compliant. So that's how we're doing it. And our Office of Information Security is looking at areas where there is a higher level of use or need to be compliant, and eventually that office is going to be responsible for looking for the funding or support or what have you. Something else we're looking at now is to set up those secure enclaves. Something else we're looking at now is trying to catch things at the proposal stage, where we can go back to the sponsors to see if there's a cost associated with meeting the compliance, see if we can incorporate it as part of the costs associated with it. But something that we're running into is we're getting industrial sponsors, so they're STTRs, SBIRs, where they're coming in incorporating the DoD clauses where it's not a DoD prime. And so we have to go back and say, you can't do that. So, and we're even seeing it from other universities. So I think it's really important for everyone to know what you have and who your sponsor is, because the DFARS apply only when DoD is the prime. But those are the kind of things that we're running into. It's just an educational learning curve.
Great, thank you. And Ian, do you want to talk a little bit about what's going on at K-State?
Yeah, great. Is my audio working?
It is.
All right. So very similar to what we heard from Penn State. So here at Kansas State University, I'll talk about where we're at right now and where we're planning to go with DoD CMMC. So yes, we do have our basic assessment in with the Department of Defense. We got it in just before the holiday season started late last year. And so, you know, we did our internal assessment, gave ourselves a fun little score. So it's an interesting grading system, potentially, you know, a negative 200 all the way up to 110 items complete. I'm happy to report that Kansas State University, we're not at 110, but we're, you know, north of 95 items in good shape. And we've got a corresponding POAM, plan of action and milestone document that articulates how we're going to get to 110. So that's where we're currently at. We've also engaged a third-party cybersecurity firm that we've got a longstanding relationship with to kind of help us take that next step, get us to 110 when it comes to a NIST 800-171 and some of the formal self-assessments that we have to update, I think every 3 years, but then also prepare for CMMC. And so we're aiming for a CMMC level 3. So we're keeping an ear to the ground with the CMMC advisory board. There's a lot of chatter, you know, that there's levels 1 through 5. There's a lot of chatter about does 2 even really make sense anymore. So we're just going to go ahead and aim for a level 3. We've engaged a cybersecurity firm. They're not a formal assessor. They're not going to be a C3PAO. I think I got that right. They will not be handing out assessments, but they do actually have a role with the CMMC advisory board. They've been certified to help DIBs, in this case, higher education institutions, get ready for the certification. So this is a pretty good group, that they're well vetted. And we've been working with them for a period of time now. K-State, we believe we're well positioned for a level 3, potentially level 4. And that's in large part due to a partnership that we have with Microsoft. And we're leaning on them to help us with a lot of the technical controls. And that's what's kind of pushing us over the top. The other reason I bring that up is it's our understanding at this time that we should only be seeing DoD CMMC level 3 requirements on 7 opportunities with the Department of Defense. These are very large scale items. There's a slow rollout at level 3. So in the current federal fiscal year, there's only 7. Don't quote me on the numbers here, but next federal fiscal year, those 7 will remain, and they're going to add another 10, and then another 10 after that. And so they're going to slowly roll that out. And I think this is a way for them to try to stay in front of the lack of assessors at level 3. And also I'll reference our budding partnership with Microsoft. There may be an opportunity where K-State could be fairly early in actually getting a formal CMMC certification. We are investigating that, looking at that. We believe we're well positioned. And if we are bold enough to take that step, we'd be more than willing to share our lessons learned and experiences, because CMMC is going to be a pretty high bar for higher education.
Great, thank you so much. So Melissa, I'm not going to steal your thunder, but we are at 12:29.
We are at 12:29. And so listening to all of this, I am reminded of some work that we had done with NARA. I think, Missy, you were on that working group, and Alex led us. And we had seemed to get to a point with NARA as it relates to the CUI program where they recognized the challenges of an entire institution certifying compliance versus being able to certify compliance for an individual project. We could dust off some of those arguments and try them on the DoD. Certainly a lot of exciting contracts conversations to come as the CMMC program grows and matures. But we are, in fact, at time 9:30 Pacific, so that we can sympathize with Mike and everyone on the West Coast, and thank them for joining us at 8 a.m. And we'll continue discussing these topics. Our contact information is up on that last slide if anyone has other suggestions or comments after the session. Thanks so much for joining us.